How should Alabama fans be feeling about this? And tell me a little bit more about the intricacies of the timing of the portal and how difficult it might be for Alabama to refill their roster.
Yeah, I think frustration would probably be the word to describe Alabama fans. I think there is obviously a layer of sadness that Saban isn't coaching the team anymore, but just looking at it from where they are right now, there's a level of frustration because again, they're at a position where they're kind of a sitting duck. They have this roster with all of these talented players, and there's this mass exodus of coaches. Nick Saban, pretty much the entire offensive staff. A lot of the defensive staff are not on the roster anymore. So a lot of these coaches that brought them into Alabama aren't there anymore. And now there's an opportunity for other schools to come in and poach their roster, and Alabama's not in a position to really go out and try to seek players to replace them because they have to deal with their own things in-house. They're trying to fill out a coaching staff. They're trying to retain their own roster. They're trying to go out and recruit prospects on the road. So it's not an enviable position. And I think that's where the frustration part comes in. I think there's also some frustration that players who seemingly would have huge roles next year are deciding to leave the program. Isaiah Bond would have been wide receiver one. You see what Kalen DeBoer and that crew did with Washington's wide receivers, Rome Odunze and Polka McMillan. You would think that Isaiah Bond would want to be a part of that, but he departs. He's going to Texas. Caleb Downs and Kadyn Proctor, two freshman starters who you would think would be staples of your roster for next season, are now in the transfer portal, and it looks like they're going other places. So I think there's some frustration that there are players that you would think would have huge roles that decide to leave versus, there are players who haven't played a lot and they're going on and they're more depth purposes, and that hurts, but you kind of understand that. So I think that's kind of where the frustration is at for Alabama fans. And as far as what this means for the next window, I think we touched on it. You can't get in-conference players in the spring portal window. So if a player enters from Georgia or Florida or wherever in the post-spring practice window, Alabama wouldn't be able to get those guys, but they can recruit nationally. I think you're kind of just wanting to know what this roster is going to look like for spring practice, and then how many young players can take a step up, and maybe you feel better about a certain position in the post-spring window than you do right now. And then at that point, you'll be able to go out nationally and try to find players who can fit some of these voids. So what I would say to Alabama fans is it is frustrating right now, and it feels like the roster is kind of reeling at this point, but this is far from over. I mean, it's January. There are going to be plenty more W's and plenty more L's between now and the first game. So we have no idea what the 2024 roster is going to look like when it's all said and done. So just, be patient right now and kind of let this thing play out.
Alabama is in a pretty difficult situation, though, because they did not know that Nick Saban was retiring during the first transfer window, a time during which they could have replenished all of the talent that they are now losing as a result of it. And when they go into the portal window in April, they aren't allowed to get SEC players, which are probably the most likely to raise the bar talent-wise and athleticism-wise in order to get to where they've been. Seth, have you seen a talent exodus like this before, and covering a team that has a depth and wealth of talent? Do you think that the situation with the transfer portal rules and the timing that this is happening at for Alabama, it's even possible for them to field a roster that looks like the Alabama teams that you've covered in the past?
This is unprecedented because of the circumstances, because of the Saban retirement on top of the portal rules and the window situation. There's probably been more than this in terms of pure number of players who have left, but the one it's most reminiscent of is LSU after the 2019 season, where that was, I think, 14 players. It was a record at that point. Georgia surpassed it a couple years later. 14 players drafted. And then other players portaled because there was a portal at that point. But I don't think there was a one-time exemption at that point. And then going into the 2020 season, you had opt-outs, like Jamar Chase opted out. So that's different circumstances, but it's the most, I think, drastic case of a loaded roster losing this many players. The one difference is, if you're being hopeful for Alabama, is they bring back their quarterback. LSU didn't bring back Joe Burrow that year. On the other hand, you're competing in an SEC where Georgia's bringing back its quarterback. Texas is bringing back its quarterback. I did a exercise earlier this week where I predicted every game in the SEC, and I actually ended up with LSU at 8-0 and 12-0, and I don't think LSU is going to go 12-0 and 8-0. It was just, this was the main point of this, was to say, hey, this is what it's going to look like in a world without divisions and with these schedules. But it also kind of pointed to that this is just going to be a really tough grind for everybody. And you've got Missouri out there, which they return a lot of people. They return their quarterback, and their schedule isn't that hard. They don't have Georgia or Alabama on it. I don't think they have Texas on it. The SEC this year is going to be really interesting. And, honestly, like Kenny said, there's a long way to go here, but because of the circumstances they're in, where they are losing this elite talent at a time when there aren't going to be elite players that will go in the portal now from other schools other than Washington and Arizona to replace it. Alabama has to go get players that are existing that went in the portal before January 2nd, unless they're from Washington. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Kalen DeBoer can go get his team at Washington and just bring it back. But because of that, at this point, I've got Alabama as kind of a 9-3 type team. But again, like Kenny said, that can change. They do get Georgia in Tuscaloosa, and they've got the spring window, and maybe this is where Kalen DeBoer, not being an SEC guy, will be helped. Maybe going and getting non-SEC players in that spring window to fill gaps he sees in spring practice will help.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll say to that in the spring window is Alabama notoriously has done very well in the spring portal window. I'm thinking of like a Jamison Williams, somebody like that they were able to pull from Ohio State and became an instant impact player. This past spring window, Jalen Key, who ended up being a starter at strong safety, Trey Amos, who ended up playing a huge role on the team as a third cornerback and had a really big impact on the SEC championship when Kool-Aid McKinstry got hurt. These are guys they added in the spring window. So there are going to be talented and quality players in that spring window for Alabama to plug holes. And depending on where the roster is at that point, you hope that young players on the roster are able to take a step up, and Jalen Milroe is able to continue developing. And on defense, they have Deontay Lawson and Jahai Campbell. Those guys can continue to develop, and you feel pretty good about the roster that you have at that point. You just need to fill a couple of gaps, and you'll have a team that I feel like you would think is in playoff contention next year.